Final Cut Pro 10 is a very interesting, powerful digital nonlinear editing application with a totally reinvented take on story creation. In this course, we'll spend time exploring many of the things that make Final Cut Pro 10 unique and versatile for editors around the world. Before getting into the details on how the software works, however, let's talk about some under-the-hood stuff, details on file structure that are important to know before launching into the more operational stuff, but things that will show you how unique and robust Final Cut Pro 10 has become in recent updates. Along those lines, a lot of this information may be especially useful for people who have worked in prior versions of Final Cut Pro 10 to see what's changed, but if you're new to the software, it's good to know this stuff too. First, let's talk a little bit about files in the editing environment. In short, there are two major groups of files that we're going to talk about: media files and project files. Now, media files are the raw video and audio files that come from recording footage on a video camera or another device. These files are very large and you don't actually change them at all. They remain whole and untouched. Now, project files are much smaller files, and they essentially point to the larger media files. Project files are the files you actually edit with, allowing you to combine your video, your images, your audio, and other types of media together into sequences. So both the media and the projects work together to make editing possible. As of Final Cut Pro 10.1, both media and projects live in what is called an event. Events house your media and projects. Now, an event can be as broad or as narrow as you need it to be. You can store many different projects and buckets of media together in a single event, or you can create a different event for each entity you're working on. Essentially, you use events to organize your projects and media in the way that makes sense for you. Now, where do events live? Again, as of Final Cut Pro 10.1, events are stored within a library. Libraries are at the top tier of this organizational structure, and essentially they house your events. You can create as many libraries as you need, and you can store these wherever you want. This model is much more versatile than previous versions of Final Cut Pro 10, where projects and events had to live in very specific locations on your system. But basically, your Final Cut Pro library stores everything you need to edit and to maintain superior media management. So let's talk a little bit more about this library system. Libraries can live anywhere, and as long as you store all of the media and projects inside of it, they're totally portable. You can literally grab an entire library and move it to another system and keep everything intact. It's a great self-contained system. Also, you are not limited to the number of events or projects that can be stored in a library. They can be big and broad or as small and focused as it makes sense for your own workflow. You can create as many libraries as you need. So if you want to create a library for each thing that you're working on, you can. Or if you want to store all of your events and projects inside of one giant library, that's okay too. And finally, libraries can be opened, closed, or backed up at any time, but you must have at least one library open when working in Final Cut Pro 10. And just one last thing about libraries, and this is especially for those people coming from previous versions of Final Cut Pro 10 that might be curious. Now, the library is represented by this purple icon here. Everything we've talked about, the events, projects, and so on, well, you can't actually see them at the Finder level. You just see this purple library icon. And most of the time, that's fine. You can just leave it alone. However, if you want to take a look inside of your Final Cut libraries, you just right-click and choose Show Package Contents. Then you can see everything. You can see the various events and projects and so on. So again, most of the time you don't need to go in there, but I did just briefly want to show you a bit about what's inside. And one final thing about file structure before we leave this issue alone. Many times, your library contains your actual raw media. If you take a look here, you'll see that I've got large files that are the actual raw video and audio. You can tell by the fact that each of these has a thumbnail of the media and because of the size. You can, if you like, however, set up your library to contain just virtual files, which can point to another folder on your system where the media actually resides. So in this case, you can see that there aren't thumbnails, just these little arrows, and all of the virtual files are really small, less than 65 kilobytes. So in the first example, everything is self-contained, and moving your libraries from one location to another is a snap. However, in the second example, it's not quite as cut and dry. Because of the virtual file system, you've got multiple buckets of information to keep track of. Again, we'll learn much more about all of these decisions and details later in the course. For now, I just wanted to introduce you briefly to the file structure that exists within the current version of Final Cut Pro 10.1, so that if you're upgrading, you can see what's changed, and if you're new to Final Cut Pro 10, you can get a little flavor of how things are laid out.